basically looking at the exploring and investigating the results of this 10-year close season for the Caribbean spiny lobster. In 2014, the close season was really enacted with the passage of the Fisheries Regulation number 2 of 2013. Originally, this close season, a 2 months close season, originally 4 months were actually proposed. If you look at the graph to the right, you would recognize originally what was proposed to fisher folks was from the 1st of May to the 31st of August. After numerous negotiations, we end up with a 2 months closing season. This had to do with the fact, for instance, having both close season for lobster and queen conch actually taking place at the same time, as well as the issues surrounding the fisheries in Barbuda, which is a mono-fisheries basically for the Caribbean spiny lobster. Along with that, the new regulation also introduced a limited entry management regime. So permits were used to actually restrict entrance into the lobster fisheries. As I had mentioned before, the objectives were basically to look at the impact of the 2 months close season, as well as analyze trends in terms of catch per unit effort, carapace length, and as well as the overall status of the fisheries. Data was acquired from commercial fishing trips. Research trips were also used to validate information, as well as stop and search at sea, as well as inspection of processing plants. With respect to the catch rates, there are significant temporal differences existed after the close season came into effect. The catch rates for traps increased at least 3-fold after the implementation of the close season. In the bottom corner, you notice it dropped in 2012 because fisher folks again adjusted their soak time for the gear due to the fact there wasn't much of a market for lobster when we had the lockdown for COVID. In terms of likelihood of catch, this is from dedicated traps that were actually dedicated for catching lobster as well as reef fish. The odds of actually catching spiny lobster was also statistically greater after the implementation of the close season. It was at least 2 times more likely. Note the number of traps hauled per trip per vessel size class were not significantly different between the 2 periods, so that this bias was not introduced. With respect to the biological in terms of the carapace length, mean size of the lobsters was significantly larger than the size of 50% maturity for females. This was based on work that was done much earlier in 2014 and then followed up again in 2017 when we also look at the issues of lobster size within protected areas inside and outside. The mean size of lobster in Antigua is 95 millimeters carapace length, and the size of 50% maturity was 95.7 millimeters. For this, the success of this was also attributed to the CAT certification program, where the export sector is a major player, as well as the hotel and restaurant sector. With the CAT certification program, we basically force the exporters to present proof of purchase from authorized vessels, vessels that were duly licensed, vessels that had approval for fishing for lobster, as well as the fishers themselves, the individuals, the traders, having the necessary license to operate as a trader. With respect to our future work, we're hoping to expand the CAT certification program by adapting it to deal with the other major players, the hotels and restaurants. They are also major buyers. Looking at things such as approved list of suppliers. So we're looking at these types of mechanisms to get the hotel and restaurant sector on board. One emerging issue and one challenge we're having is how we can look at. Mr. Lester had mentioned this much earlier. How can a bottom-up approach to local and national fisheries fit into a regional approach, which is somewhat top-down? If you look, this map presents the various close season across the entire region, within the Wake Sea region. It has been harmonized with respect to our pesca in the Latin American countries. You have some level of harmonization within the OECS. As you can see, these seasons vary. From a biological standpoint, you would try and want to get the maximum gain from the close season by having it within the maximum breeding period. But then on the flip side to that, there's something you can actually gain in terms of harmonizing with respect to trading off. Say, for instance, if you export your neighbor, for instance, the French territories, which are close to the OECS, which have been our traditional partners, if they have similar harmonized close season, this reduces the risk of transshipment at sea. As you would realize, most of our borders are somewhat porous. Now, thank you. I'd like to also say much of this work would not have been possible, without the support of the former Chief Fisheries Officer, Michelle Jeffrey Appleton, as well as Fisherfolk leader, Mr. Mitchell Lay, and the late Shakalal from Wake Sea, as well as Hennig from FAO Legal Office, as well as Mr. Horton, as well as Terence Phillip, who also participated in a lot of discussions when we were looking at the whole aspect of the close season and when we had our national symposium to look at all the issues. Thank you. I'll keep it, move on because I think we're running behind time.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Horsford. A wonderful presentation. And that last graphic showing the different close season across the region was particularly interesting. All right. Mr. Murray has his hand up, and then Mr. Kong.
Thank you so much. Excellent as expected, Ian. Just a question. And let me note that I see you spoke of 4 months, but due to perhaps political reasons, it was reduced to 2. Same issues that we found in Jamaica. The peak spawning period is actually 4 months, but because of strategy, it was reduced to 3. But have you seen any notion of changes in peak spawning? Some data in Jamaica tend to suggest that that might be the case, and of course, differences in the size of the animal that have begun to spawn. Have you seen any of that sort of data?
Yeah, for instance, when the much earlier study in 2014, we looked at data dating as far back as in 1995. So what you saw with the graph, it was actually a best fit. We use a polynomial fit for the graph, but you'd see sometimes it comes a bit earlier. For instance, instead of May, sometimes it's earlier, as much as early as April, or it shifts further. So what we did, we actually used all the information to try and take into account all the variability. Hopefully that would be enough, because we have the whole issue with respect to climate change, changing sea surface temperatures. So we'd have to also adjust for that. That is something that we also have to follow up in the future, because we have seen it even prior to that. We have also seen it for other species. For instance, we also have a close season for a NASA group of red hind. Sometimes it's much earlier, as opposed to the peak being in January. Sometimes it shifts back. It starts earlier, such as in some cases as in November. So you have these annual variations. So you have to have a fairly long time series to deal with all the variabilities. The peaks shift maybe by a month or 2 sometimes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Horsford. All right. So we do have 3 hands raised in the chat. I'm going to ask you to make it fast so that we can go on to the next presentation. Mr. Murray?
Ian, I was saying great presentation. Very interesting. I was curious As far as I remember, the OECS countries had agreed on a harmonized carapace length of 95 millimeters. You are showing an increase in carapace length, and from what you say, your carapace length is around that. The mean carapace length of your catch is about that. So people are catching just about at the minimum size if you all are instituting that minimum size. And the size at 50% maturity is 95.7. Do you have any idea to what extent what you are seeing is showing in the other countries that share the minimum size, assuming that you are actually using that agreed minimum size? Thanks.
In the past, I've seen data from other countries. When I think Williana was in St. Lucia, we had looked at some data sets, and it was roughly around along that's fall within that ballpark. For Grenada, I can't speak to Grenada. I haven't looked at Grenada data sets. I've seen some in some cases from St. Kitts. It tends to be in that context, but it also depends on how you approach determine the size of first maturity. There are some methods that are more accurate, but then you have the issue of a small sample size, as opposed, for instance, if you're looking at it gross, basically looking for eggs and presence of intact tar. That approach, as opposed to, for instance, you're looking at it within a lab where you look at the reproductive structure.
All right, thank you. Mr. Horton, and then Gittin. I was going to ask you to keep it nice and concise.
Yeah, just a very brief intervention here again. And Lester had raised a very important point, and which is the fact that we're dealing with a unitary stock in the Caribbean region, one stock. So although we have variation in the actual management measures that are implemented in different areas, to some extent, because we're dealing with single stock in the region that has implication, and the management of the stocks in the Eastern Caribbean area all the way down to Brazil, I think, is critical, because that is the area of where the spawning stocks will probably contribute to production and fisheries further up current, because the larva will spend several months drifting in the ocean. So the fact that the Eastern Caribbean countries have set their minimum size at about 95 is quite significant and important when you look at the big regional picture, because when you come further west and north, you have much smaller minimum size. And I think some of the countries probably have taken that into consideration in setting their minimum size. The other point I want to make is the fact that climate change is likely to have significant impact, and we have to monitor what is happening with the changing temperature and acidity of the water in respect to the lobster fishery, because we know that the lobsters require specific environment, especially in terms of temperature, in order to spawn. So with the warming waters that we are seeing now, this is a concern. And so let me leave it there, because in the interest of time. But those are a couple of issues that I think we have to pay careful attention to going forward.
All right, thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for that intervention, Mr. Horton. Mr. Gittins.
Good day. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ian, for an excellent presentation. I'll just briefly state that each country really and truly should re-examine their closed seasons for all the reasons mentioned by Milton just now, especially climate change and the St. George's Declaration. When we were deliberating it, I think we did take that into account, that should be recommended, that you should really reevaluate your closed seasons. But the other point I wanted to make too is that the closed season is just one measure. But the Caribbean spiny lobster, historically, they are known to mate year-round, especially for the really large lobsters. So yes, the closed season will have an effect, but certainly you need other measures to complement it, like the size limit mentioned as well. And so it is important to consider your whole suite of measures. And so if you tweak your closed season in response to industry pressure or stakeholder pressure, that is fine as long as it's supported by a large size limit like they have in Antigua and other measures in place. So thank you very much. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Gittins. And thanks again, Mr. Horsford.